said, we've talked about nominations, and you talked about DeVos. She's someone that there's not going to be one Democrat vote for. This isn't about her responses to questions. This was decided a long time ago. She was in the red area of the bullseye, and every effort was going to be made to kill her. Well, that's wrong. And Ms. Maddow went on to say somebody like Betsy Devos doesn't deserve. She said, should we expect that because of some strategic whip effort among Democratic senators, or do you think that everybody agrees on their own terms that somebody like Betsy DeVos does not deserve a vote? And Senator Franken said, well, we've discussed it today, and we have a strategy. This is a strategy. Let's face it. That's why Senator Scott got all the calls he did. That's why I got all the calls. That's why my wife gets calls. My son gets calls on cell phones to deliver a message to me. Well, I don't think it can be summed up any better than Senator Scott summed it up. He's one that's lived it. He understands how important somebody like Betsy DeVos can be to the next Tim Scott. An opportunity to have a choice, an opportunity to create an option. Let me sum up again. The only thing she's aspired to is moving the power out of this town and moving it to states and localities where local school systems can make decisions about their future. Gosh, we've tried this for a long time and it hadn't worked. Why don't we try trusting the people who are elected locally to decide how their children, in fact, are educated, and more importantly than that, how they construct a system that lets every child succeed. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Burr. Senator Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to say I share Senator Murray's and Senator Murphy's frustration with the confirmation process. We were not allowed to ask Ms. DeVos a second round of questions during her hearing, which I was allowed to do during the previous Secretary of Education's hearing. Instead, we were forced to have a hearing before her ethics review was finished, and we were denied a second hearing to question Ms. DeVos about her very complicated ethics documents and the shady investments that she insists on keeping. Now, Mrs. DeVos hasn't even completed the committee paperwork, which means she is still hiding critical information from this committee. This is a rush job by Republicans, and the American people, I think, are smart enough to see what's happening here. I will vote against Mrs. DeVos's nomination to serve as Secretary of Education because her nomination is not in the best interest of America's young people. You know, Mrs. DeVos has repeatedly demonstrated her contempt for public education. Her record on K-12 education has been focused on using her vast fortune to push her own ideology on hardworking families that are just trying to get their kids a decent education in public schools. Not only are her ideas completely uninformed by experience with public schools, but the evidence is clear that her K-12 privatization theories are bad for students. I also want to point out that a very important part of what the Secretary of Education does has to do with colleges, with higher education. I gave her the opportunity to prove to the American people that she is serious about standing up for students. During her confirmation hearing, I asked Mrs. DeVos basic, straightforward questions about her commitment to protecting students and taxpayers from fraud committed by shady, for-profit colleges. But she was unwilling to commit to using the department's many tools and resources to keep students from getting cheated when fraudulent colleges break the law. And in her responses to my written questions, she even refused to commit to canceling the loans of students who have been cheated by law-breaking colleges, a requirement that is there in the law. Her refusal to enforce the law will saddle thousands of people with debts that the law says they are not obligated to pay. Mrs. DeVos also plans to maintain financial ties that could create conflicts of interest. I wrote to Mrs. DeVos last week with several of my Democratic colleagues to raise concerns about her potential conflicts, things that clearly are not resolved. by her public ethics agreement. We requested a response to simple questions regarding the lack of transparency in the investments that she would maintain in family trusts and the lingering potential for conflicts of interest, and we have not received an answer from Mrs. DeVos. I've listened to the chairman characterize Democrats' opposition to Mrs. DeVos as an opposition to charter schools. That simply is not true. Before her nomination hearing, I received a letter sent to me by the Massachusetts Charter Public School Association about Mrs. DeVos's devastating record of promoting for-profit and online charter schools with virtually no accountability or oversight for how well these schools actually serve students. I entered that letter into the record during her hearing. Unlike the thoughtful, innovative, and successful education policies we have embraced in Massachusetts with regard to public charter schools, the policies Mrs. DeVos has bankrolled have drained valuable taxpayer dollars out of the public education system in Michigan and left Michigan's kids worse off. I have heard from thousands of teachers, of parents, of education leaders in Massachusetts raising deep concerns about Mrs. DeVos. I hear their concerns and I share their concerns. It is hard to imagine a candidate less qualified or more dangerous to be entrusted both with our country's education policy and with the $1 trillion student loan program. And that is why I urge my colleagues to reject Mrs. DeVos's nomination.